we can bring some synthesis to what have been wonderfully divergent views on a lot of this stuff. I mean, that's what we're here for, is to hear those views. But how can we synthesize? Some of the questions we'll have our panelists linger over, and certainly if you want to pick up on a previous panelist saying something, just do so. You don't have to wait for me to do so. And I bet you there's going to be some questions where we do kind of like a lightning round, where we just like whip through people and everybody gets 10 seconds or something to say yes or no or briefly comment. But that'll become clear as we go along. Just to start with one of the audience members suggested a good way to start, which is we've touched on this for a second, but do panelists see a connection between the trade discussion, trade policy, and immigration in the U.S.? That's an even perhaps more hot button issue. I mean, and it doesn't even have to be the U.S., in other parts of the world as well. We often talk about goods moving across borders, services, data, intellectual property, but it's also people. And so how far removed is the immigration debate from the stuff we have been talking about? Who wants to start?
I'll jump in. I mean, I think what typically happens is immigration gets the blame for the stuff that trade policy is often unfairly blamed for, that goes along with the stuff that actually matters, that nobody talks about enough, which is the bottom-up redistribution of wealth that accompanies a lot of the stuff that goes along with trade policy. So, I mean, I got to get back to what Senator Sununu said earlier. You know, yes, we can talk about Reagan setting in motion multilateral trade deals, and I'm among the people who's already said I think trade in general, if it's done right, is a good thing. But, you know, Reagan did some other things too. He set in motion regressive tax cuts, undercut progressive taxation. He completely eviscerated antitrust enforcement, which has continued straight on through every presidential administration since on both sides of the aisle. And that's part of the reason why we're in this winner-take-all situation where the bounty of trade has not flowed equitably, and there's really no way you're going to influence the politics of trade without rectifying those errors. And so what then typically happens is we end up creating an opportunity for somebody to demonize immigrants, which we've seen not only in this country, in Britain through Brexit, Italy, Sweden, and on it goes.
I just wanted to add that immigration is really the superpower of the U.S. So we source talent from 7-8 billion people around the world. China does not. So one way to really compete with China is to do much more on immigration, and especially talented folks coming in. The H-1B, which is how people with higher education or special skills come in, that cap hasn't increased in what, Jennifer, like 20, 30 years, despite the fact that we've had huge growth of those sectors. The trucking shortage could have been solved like that with bringing in some truck drivers from other parts of the world. Trade is relatively liberalized. There are umpteen studies out there showing that the gains from opening immigration more would way swamp the gains from further trade liberalization, but it's just such a politically hot-button topic because of cultural issues of bringing immigrants in that more doesn't happen. But this is a country of immigrants. You know, almost everyone in this room is probably an immigrant from somewhere, historically.
I don't want to litigate Ronald Reagan's economic record. You can agree with him or disagree with him, but in all seriousness and to the point, he presided and championed the most significant reform to immigration the country has ever seen, and unfortunately, we have yet to see another significant one, and he provided amnesty and probably ultimately citizenship for 3 million illegal immigrants. So, on this point, can it be done? And can you find Republicans who would support real immigration reform? I think the answer is yes. I think we can find linkages between the two, but from a policy and a legislative standpoint, you almost don't want them to be linked because they're such challenging and complex issues in and of themselves. And I think there is an immigration deal to be had that, it expands agricultural technology workers, cleans up the green card program, and provides some sort of a path to legalization for many, not necessarily all of those that are in the country illegally, but it's going to be a challenge. But I think it is there, and I think if the makeup of Congress had been slightly different, that would actually be within reach under the Biden administration.
David, reading your body language?
Yeah. I think, a lot of the reaction to trade in China is actually a fear of U.S. decline and a sense that we're being out-innovated and out-competed. And a key to our innovation historically has been immigration. Being at MIT, our great secret is we steal the most talented people from all over the world, right? We don't produce them, we just bring them in. And we should recognize that the U.S. remains the most innovative country in the world, and that's extraordinary. ChatGPT, you may find it scary, you may find it ridiculous. It is striking that it came out of here, and even people in China are saying, AI research, why didn't we produce that? Well, there's a reason they didn't produce it, and they'd be afraid to produce it. So our innovative edge, which we have maintained for a century, is something we don't know how we do it. We definitely don't want to lose it, but it's got to be that one of the ingredients has been bringing people in from all over the world who feel like they can succeed here, they can innovate, they can create, and they will be rewarded for it, supported in doing it, and they will find the talent they need. And immigration is central to that.
We had featured a researcher, some weeks ago on the air, who had data that showed that when you bring in, when increases in skilled people from overseas increase the number of patents in the U.S., and maybe you would assume that, but the interesting wrinkle was bringing in skilled immigrants, for research and so forth, also increases the number of patents by native-born researchers in the areas where you bring in more immigration. Really, really interesting. Any other comments on immigration and linkage or not to trade?
I guess the only point I've been tried to make yesterday was that what I'm afraid of is the move from Klan to contract back to Klan. And listening to everybody in the last couple of days, that notion or that apprehension is reinforced. And immigration would be part of that. Immigration, rejection of immigration back to Klan. Hey, that's the other guy. Make America great again, America as it is now, without noting that America is all these clans coming together over all these years. There were two quotes that I had wanted to read in my speech, but cut for time. And so I'm always thinking here big picture. And so the first one is from Voltaire. At the time when it was first proposed that contract was the way to peace. And so he said, "Go into the London Stock Exchange, a more respectable place than many a court, and you will see representatives from all nations gathered together for the utility of men. Here, Jew, Mohammedan, and Christian deal with each other as though they were all of the same faith, and only apply the word infidel to people who go bankrupt. Here, the Presbyterian trusts the Anabaptist, and the Anglican accepts a promise from the Quaker. On leaving these peaceful and free assemblies, some go to the synagogue and others for a drink. This one goes to be baptized in a great bath in the name of Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost. That one has his son's foreskin cut and has some Hebrew words he doesn't understand mumbled over the child. Others go to their church and await the inspiration of God with their hats on, and everybody is happy." In 1932, last quote, Mussolini wrote the only, or supposedly wrote the only explanation of fascism, which up until 1932, until Hitler, Churchill was, for example, a big fan of fascism, which was just, putting sticks together, binding them from Rome, put the sticks together and hatch it. and you're stronger as a group than you are as an individual stick, which can get broken. That's a fasces. Lincoln on the Lincoln Memorial, his arms are propped up by two fasces. Fascism does not, generally speaking, believe in the possibility or utility of perpetual peace. War alone keys up human energies to their maximum tension and sets the seal of nobility on those peoples who have the courage to face it. So those are sort of the antipodes here. And my concern, as I tried to explain for a bunch of reasons, is going back towards this one.
Yeah, that last one seems to be something that may be embraced in parts of Russia right now.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what are we going to do? Should we, well, let's just do Rob, because the house lights aren't on. I can't quite see the volunteers. But Rob, it looks like you got a good question for the panel. And this is a VIP, so you better give him his mic.
Bob Hirsch, Owl's Head. We've been very fortunate to hear 10 very substantive talks over the past 2 days. One word that was never mentioned once, to my amazement, was cyber currency. It was never mentioned once. I have a tremendous fear of potential downside for cyber currency, but I'd like to hear comments on from the panel on what they see as the implications of cyber currency for trade, and particularly for the US dollar as the world reserve currency. Is it a threat to that?
Yeah, Bob, all this, crypto helps circumvent institutions, regulators. I like calling it money laundering on a stick on the air. What are some thoughts about that whole field of cyber finance and so forth as it applies to trade? Peter?
It's mostly a Ponzi scheme. It's been exposed as such, given that it's clearly not a hedge against inflation, and someday, don't know when, it will die, and someone will write a wonderful book about the latest con to befall global capitalism.
Mark.
I think when it comes to trade rules are made by governments. Governments certainly view crypto for the reasons Peter just alluded to, right, as a possible security and public order threat. I think that I alluded to this yesterday in my talk, right, that the digital domain is expanding so rapidly, it's unregulated, and I think this is another reason you're going to see trade rules move more towards a security direction. The other thing that came up yesterday was talking about sanctions. Obviously, there are some governments out there that would like to use forms of digital currency to be able to weaken the U.S. and others' ability to enforce sanctions. But those types of moves would be through a government-regulated digital currency as opposed to a crypto. So I think, again, right, the rise of crypto, the fact that it's all unregulated is going to push governments to move trade rules towards a much more security orientation.
People may have seen Paul Krugman's article about a month ago about crypto, in which he said, well, it's being pitched as a cool way to get around regulation. But when these big currency exchanges melt down, everybody screams for regulation, and then it gets regulated, what's going to be its utility? But surely there's underlying technology underneath Bitcoin that's going to change the world that may have value. David?
Yeah, the important innovation that's underneath Bitcoin is the blockchain, the notion of verifiable transactions that don't require a verifier. And that's a powerful idea and will be used for many things, including contracts and insurance, for chains of ownership, even for physically owning a digital good, which was previously inconceivable prior to the blockchain. So I think it's an incredibly important technology. Digital currency per se has not succeeded. And normally when a technology's been around for a decade, it finds a killer app, right? GPS, a killer app in your phone. It makes things like Uber useful. Cameras on your phone, right? They gave us the kind of social internet. There are many, many technologies that after a while we figure out what they're for, and then we put them to use. And so far, no one has figured that out for blockchain. The only things used for is currency speculation and criminal activity in a way that's ironically visible, but slightly hard to trace, although not as hard as the criminals used to hope. So blockchain's important. Digital currency, not so much.
Paul?
My grandson would be horrified to hear you all talking this way. And I just checked that Bitcoin is up to $25,000. It was down to 16 about, I don't know, 3 weeks ago, a month ago, something like that. And
But I bought it at 63,000.
yes, you bought it at 63,000, but in 2013, when I did my first piece on Bitcoin at a conference in New York, a guy said to me, I can get you a donation to the PBS NewsHour. And he went around the room and he came back. Now, I don't know if he was not telling the truth, but he said, I've got you $25,000 in pledges. What was Bitcoin at that time? $130.
Well,
And we called, because it wasn't our call, and the guy who ran the PBS NewsHour at the time said, no, we're not going to legitimize, Bitcoin and so forth. And that's several million dollars in today's money. Of course, we would have sold earlier.
you would have sold at the peak, man. You would.
Do you accept Dutch tulip bulbs and
What?
pets.com stock?
Look, what about gold? I think, in defense of my grandson, I don't have any Bitcoin. I didn't even buy it 130. But in defense of it, David Otter here just won $100 trillion from me.
In Zimbabwean currency.
Yesterday in Zimbabwean currency. He figured out how to do that shower that I was telling you about. I'm not kidding. He did it in 15 seconds. He said he could do it in 15 seconds, and he did it. So I paid him the $100 trillion. And the $100 trillion, and Doug Irwin says he uses those same notes in his class to show what can happen to a sovereign or fiat, as in fiat looks, let there be light, right? Fiat currency. So, gold, what's gold? For jewelry? It's an asset everybody has come to believe in and believes in it because everybody believed in it for so long. There's a whole group of people out there, libertarians, young people, and so forth, who believe in this. If they believe in it long enough, I'm still not buying Bitcoin at 16, 25,000, whatever. You can buy a tiny sliver of it. I have one, for $11 worth, which is now worth $33 because I did it on air to show how you do it. But I just wouldn't be as utterly dismissive, Peter, as you are, that's all.
Volunteer number 1 is going to help pick somebody. Can't quite see.
Hi, I'm Kiki Tidwell. I'm in Cape Nettic, Maine, but I'm a refugee from the West. It's pretty drought-stricken and fire-driven out there, and if you don't believe there's going to not be more of me, you should listen to American Public Media's podcast, How We Survive. So New England has got to be prepared for this. But my question is, traditionally, power has resulted in those nations that had the natural resources of coal and oil. And now that all of the countries can make their own power through solar and wind and other resources, wouldn't it behoove America to give that technology to Africa and other countries that are our friends to promote power in other countries besides the traditional fossil fuel rich countries?
Yeah, it wouldn't be I think the technology is probably available, but it would be manufacturing capacity and so forth. Ajay?
So, yeah, I think you're absolutely right. The main issue now is for most of the global south, as we call it, Africa particularly, but also other like South Asia, Latin America. The main issue is that even though the technology may be available somewhere in the US and in other places, but how do you get it at a reasonable cost, and then how do you finance it? Those are the big issues in this climate transformation that everybody's pledged towards. We have this SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals at the UN. So the key issue is not, and the technology is also moving better and better, So the big issue out there is how do you lever this money over in a reasonable way that, you de-risk the investment to such an extent that it actually does happen and help people. So you're absolutely right, I think.
I'd only add that, when you look at it for almost every developing country, the issue that they want when they're thinking about doing renewable energy, and for what it's worth, I did a lot of this study when we were looking at the Belt and Road Initiative. And one of the criticisms of that Belt and Road Initiative is that, among other things, it built 260 coal-fired power plants in these other countries. So we did a lot of asking of some of these governments, why? Why did you accept this Belt and Road project to build this coal-fired power plant? Because part of the problem with it is most of those plants are expected to operate for 30 to 35 years, and the economic model for which you can get a payback assumes that you do operate for a significant period of time. Why did you do it? The answers were very interesting, but largely centered on we didn't think our grid would work if we used solar or wind or other things, which is factually not true, but again, there was this kind of urban myth, if you will. Secondly, our regulatory system requires us effectively to use coal-fired power. But third and most important was you weren't offering an alternative. I mean, that was the only game in town, was to take the Chinese money, the Belt and Road project. So I do think part of what's happening, and it is happening, is other countries standing up alternative projects that have to be public-private partnerships, because for most of the developing world, what they really need is help with technology transfer. They need genuine help with human capital development so that you're not just building the plant that then nobody can run or operate or maintain, and you need capital. And that is going to be happening in a lot of public-private partnerships. For example, there was a program started in the Obama administration, and you could look at it to see kind of how this works, called Power Africa, run again as an absolute public-private partnership, a number of U.S. government agencies that were helping with the engineering, helping with some of the putting together of the coalitions that it would take, and we're building renewable energy plants across a lot of sub-Saharan Africa. So it's there, but it is really critical that we say we have an alternative to just accepting the continued building of coal-fired power.
Any other comments on that?
Well, yeah, look, it would be terrific if we provided solar turbine technology to sub-Saharan Africa or other countries around the world that want it, that need it. You can say we should pay for it, we should subsidize it, that's fine. But you cannot operate a modern power grid without meaningful base load. Okay, and we need to stop speaking in ways that suggest otherwise. You just can't. Now, we can talk about whether that consistent base load needs to be 50% capability, 80%, 85%, whatever it might be, but it has to be there, given today's technology. And that can only come from nuclear, oil-fired, which is very rare, natural gas, coal, or hydro. Those are the only realistic sources. And so these countries that we're talking about, many of which are the poorest countries in the world, with the lowest per capita incomes in the world, they need the energy. The energy is growth, the energy is opportunity, the energy is a better standard of living for their citizens. And to say you can only do it if you use renewables is to deny them the growth, the wealth, the opportunity that we take for granted every day. So I don't know. I don't have an easy answer. I don't know how you do it. And certainly, I mean, there is hydro in a lot of parts of Africa that have great potential. But to think that you don't need fossil fuels to expand the base load and improve standards of living in Africa, that's a huge mistake. And it's doing a disservice, a tremendous injustice to the poorest people in the world.
Yeah, we're talking in part that the wind doesn't always blow and the sun doesn't always shine, but we have someone on the panel, Ajay, who's actually built hydro himself with his bare hands in Africa.
Not in Africa, but I do agree with John on this point, but just to take India as an example, our plan is to get out of coal into natural gas and then and renewable. And he's absolutely right. It can be 50-50. So natural gas plus solar plus all the renewables and hydro and nuclear. But that transition is now affected by, despite all the problems with the Trump administration was committed then to make sure that India could import LNG from the United States. And I don't know the current status of the talks with the Biden administration, but when the Biden administration came, they had put a stop to this. India had gone ahead, including people like Adani, who's in the press, building the infrastructure to start importing LNG from the US on a big scale, because we do import LNG from Kuwait and the Middle East countries, but the idea was to have this, and then everything got put on hold for a while. So it's a complicated issue, but broadly speaking, I mean, we need to get the technologies there so that we can get out of coal and into much cleaner fuel. That will be both a combination of LNG. I don't think fossil fuel will completely go away, but at least we can get out of the dirtiest of the sources of energy.
There was a hand here, volunteer one, a very patient person. If you can just trot up to this gentleman.
Hi, Jim Matlack again from Camden. It's a double question. First, to Dr. Chibber, as you work on the economic development of India, looking for positive growth, to what extent do attitudes and practices from the caste system pose a problem that works against your best hopes? And the second part of it goes to David Autor in a similar fashion. As you work on labor and economic development in the United States, how do you both identify and account for discriminatory attitudes in this country toward minority groups, African American, Latino, Native American?
Want to start with Ajay?
Well, of course, discrimination on caste or any other ground is illegal in the Indian Constitution, but nevertheless, it gets practiced. It's a bigger problem in rural areas because once people move out of the rural, where people can be easily identified that this village is this caste and this village is that caste. But once people move to the urban areas, there's no distinguishing mark. Nobody could tell what my caste is in India. I could be a Brahmin, I could be any of the castes, right? There's nothing physically distinguishing somebody from a different caste. So it goes by name and who you know from villages. So as soon as what I'm trying to say is, as you urbanize, the issue gets less and less important. Nevertheless, it's a huge problem. We've also had a huge affirmative action program. So we have a lot of job reservations for people of different castes. And then the political battles are over which subcaste are you from, and can this subcaste get this privilege or that privilege? We also have a huge debate in our country on how long will we keep this affirmative action going, because now it's the children of the grandchildren actually of the first wave that got affirmative action that are still benefiting from it, even though they may now be quite well off. But, I'm not an expert on the issue, but it is an issue. My wife is an expert on caste. She writes the Encyclopedia of Sociology. If you look at caste and race, She's the one who writes that. And she tells me this is a centuries-old deprivation that cannot be removed in even 2 or 3 generations. So you have to continue with these policies. So it's a combination of things, but as such, if you run a business or you're laying roads and whatever, electricity and now in schools there's an issue because in schools the teacher knows which caste you're from just simply by your name, and there can be a problem there that some teachers discriminate, etc. So it's a complicated issue, but it's a problem which we are tackling with slowly and slowly.
On the issue of race and opportunity in the United States, let me make 2 comments. First, there's no question that there's pervasive racism at every level and every institutions. You can certainly see that in policing. The most recent evidence, even from data from Lyft, for example, the car service that basically, accounting for where you're driving, when you're driving, what vehicle you're driving, and so on. Black drivers get harassed more. So there's discrimination in all places. However, I don't think that's the primary barrier to opportunity for minorities or African Americans or blacks in America. I think the much bigger barrier is the change in the composition of jobs. The decline of manufacturing, the decline of the Rust Belt, before it was the Rust Belt, was hugely damaging to black economic progress and led to a incredible halt of the progress of convergence that had been going on for decades earlier. And I think that the most consequential lever for improving that is going to be changing the labor market and changing the set of jobs available, as well as investing in education. So, for example, most of the good jobs in America require a 4-year college degree. About 75% of black and Hispanic men do not have a 4-year college degree. So if you need a 4-year college degree to have a good job, 3/4 of black men and Hispanic men are just like, they're out of the game initially. Fortunately, in the very tight labor markets that we're in, employers are reconsidering what credentials they require for employment. And that's good. And that's state governments are doing this. When Jeannie Rometty was head of IBM, she led an initiative to sort of say, look, we don't need college graduates to do tech security, to do certain types of programming, to do customer support. We just need people who have some STEM skills that we can train. So I think while I fully agree with the gist of the question that racism is prevalent and problematic, I don't think that's the point of leverage for addressing these opportunity barriers, not the place I'd start.
Jennifer.
I was only going to just add one sort of interesting, I guess I'm going to put back on my little gender hat here, is it is interesting to look at what has been done in terms of the protection in the United States. If you think about it, those initial tariffs that the Trump administration put on were, again, on steel and aluminum. And, again, the argument being that we're being flooded with imports because of a significant amount of overcapacity. But if you look at then who is that really working towards, the vast majority of that employment in those sectors tends to be white men. And if you step back from it and look at, well, what's the industry in the United States that's the most impacted by imports and is the most, if you will, facing this kind of import competition where you might want to think about putting tariffs on, it's the textile and clothing industry. Well, who works in the textile and clothing industry? Women, and predominantly women of color. So did you hear anyone say anything in the last 5 years about protecting the textile industry? No. Clothing industry? No. Again, it is a very gendered policy, to make no doubt about what we've been. So I'm just saying that discrimination in that sense is also there in which industries we're choosing to protect and which ones we're not.
Carolyn.
Yeah, I just wanted to, since the question was about discrimination, gender also came into my mind. And while more women are going to college now, it's still the case that at the elite levels in most fields, including economics, it's mostly men. And one of the policies that would have helped the absolute most and would help to this day is childcare, which is available to a much greater extent. All the women are clapping in Europe. And it would also help single mothers, which tend to be more prevalent in the population of low income and underrepresented minorities. So I really think that would be a key step to helping. And then because what the point Jennifer made, I just want to make sure it's interpreted correctly in terms of I don't think she was arguing we should be protecting textiles. I think it was arguing that steel gets more attention, although I would say apparel left the U.S. a lot earlier and to a greater extent, but it's just the things we tend to focus on are people who have power and are noisy, and that's why it's steel. But there was no intent, I'm sure, to say we should be putting tariffs on apparel.
Correct.
I just wanted to add about childcare and an argument for it. There are now more men, you've heard about men out of the workforce, working age men out of the workforce, and I just interviewed a couple of men who are house husbands who say they wouldn't be if there were childcare. So it's no longer just a women's issue.
But I also think that there's connective tissue through this entire really interesting conversation about, another term that hasn't been thrown around, but it's neoliberalism, right? I mean, you go back to the impetus for these multilateral trade deals, you go back to the 80s and all this deregulation, and, we talked the other night briefly about welfare reform, which was supposed to allow, everybody to get into this vibrant workforce, and they were going to get their piece of the action through all this growth that was in part being promoted by trade deals. And it's quite right to call out the fact that we haven't done right by the people who are supposed to be going and joining the workforce, despite the fact they often have kids by themselves to look after. And that's just one of many examples of the policies that need to go along. I mean, childcare, we could talk about infinitely. It's hugely important. There are lots of others: healthcare, housing, transportation. I mean, there are lots of people who can't get to the jobs that are available because we've gutted public transportation because basically we don't tax rich people in America. So unless you have these other support pieces, the growth that you promote from trade policies simply don't allow enough people to do what we keep saying we want them to do, which is go out and earn a living instead of just living off the government.
Yeah.
I'm going to do something unusual, which is I'm just going to put on the table, but let's not answer it just yet, a question from a remote location, Allison Warden. Just, you can let it percolate for a little bit, and we'll come back to it. The way it reads is this: what actions can individuals and small business owners take to address trade imbalances, security concerns, and human rights violations? In other words, what that question seems to me to be is, what are action points for actual humans and small businesses based on everything we're talking about? But just let that percolate for a little bit. You can make some notes as you go along. We'll come back to Allison's question. Volunteer 2 has a gentleman there. Yeah.
Hi, Hank there, Weathersfield, Connecticut, again. Question for any and all on the panel. Very much enjoyed the talk. Maybe pull us up to a little higher level. Given that trade is a tremendous net good, we've seen that over and over, huge net good, but that it can create terrible disruptions. And also that for national security reasons, there are certain industries that we simply must not lose. What specific policies could we adopt, and how do we sell that to the voters? Thank you. For anyone who wants.
Yeah, what's an agenda wish list from the panel for addressing the bigger things first, for instance? Anybody want to start taking that on? It's a big question. Because, I'm not sure we can use the WTO, and Senator Sununu is not so sure politicians are that interested right now. They're at least their attention is not on it. But some people may say that climate change is the top thing that they want dealt with. Others would say other things.
The premise of the question, right, or at least part of the question, there are industries we cannot lose. I don't know if that's true. Certainly not in perpetuity. There might be industries that are priorities right now. There might be technologies. And, look at the advanced chip actions we took against China technologies we think are too valuable or too dangerous, that we have to be careful about how we share them with others. Nuclear centrifuge technology, for example. In the 80s, though, right, and I don't know the status now, but in the 80s, it was advanced machining technology. So the machining equipment that was sophisticated enough to machine submarine propeller blades in a way that didn't cavitate and therefore was less detectable by the Russians in the Cold War era. So, you know, those technologies that are priority national security technologies, they exist. I don't have a list, but they certainly exist. They exist today, they'll exist tomorrow, but they won't necessarily be the same. They may change over time. And then insofar as, you know, we have to save the automotive industry, we have to have an aviation airplane industry. You know, I think there you look more carefully at national security issues, right? Aviation, national defense, national security. So it may be an industry, but we may also say, well, that's a technology, right? That falls into the category of protected technologies. And lastly, one of the reasons I'm always a little bit cautious in making these declarations, if you go back in time, not that far, as to say 25 or 30 years, about technologies or industries that everyone in Congress, Democrat, Republican, didn't matter, was sure would be the future. Making ethanol from switchgrass, hydrogen cars, nanotechnology. It's not that these technologies don't exist, but they certainly didn't warrant the subsidy, protection, investment that they gained at the time by declaring, so to speak, that we're the technology of the future that every country must protect if it wants to be competitive in the 21st century.
I just wanted to go back to the trade and peace discussion we had a bit yesterday. And the European Union and its various earlier forms was initially, the very first part of it was the coal and steel community. And in the creation of the coal and steel community in Europe, it was written that it was formed to make war not only costly, but materially impossible, because coal and steel would be shared across Germany and France and so on. And so I think integration makes us have better access to all the various different things we need now for our incredibly, incredibly complex production. And I also, while we look and we say, oh, but dependence turned out to be bad in the case of Russia, there's always what's the counterfactual. And so with the case of China, I would argue that we'd already be a lot closer to war if we weren't so incredibly intertwined. And so having trade in industries can be good. And I think when the economies get hit enough by this decoupling, our sides might be able to talk. And I was talking with a fellow over the break, John Campbell, about what would it take in the US, and one thought is when it really makes the stock market tank when companies don't have access to China. So that could be a way that business finally comes, and to Washington. It's already happening. It happened to some extent in China, and they softened their policy when they realized they're not going to have growth. So just to say that I think that there is still integration can still be good for peace. And exactly as Senator Sununu said, it's really hard to pick industries. We're going to put a lot of money in semiconductors, but my guess is there's going to be a glut in the future. Already you see those stocks tanking. I own AMD stock, and it isn't what it was when there was a shortage, I can tell you that. So.
I own AMD stock too. I don't know if that makes me feel better or worse.
Well, I was looking at the books over in the Tucker room, and one of the books for sale is by a guy I assume Peter's also talked to, Ray Dalio, quadrillionaire, founded the biggest hedge fund of them all, I guess. And you've talked to Dalio?
He's in my book.
Oh, yeah. So he has a lot of opinions, as you've noticed, right?
He does.
Yeah, he holds forth. But he thinks that he accepts essentially, for instance, Peter's view that there's this decoupling and that China is no longer going to be the center. And he thinks long-term that hurts the stock market, that you get less out of the stock market because profits are therefore lower. And so part of what we're talking about is, are consumers willing to pay more for the resilience that might come with shorter supply chains? But there's an effect on stock prices as well. Not everybody owns a stock in America, even indirectly. Always remind people of that. Stock market is not the economy, someone else at Marketplace likes to say over and over. Over here, volunteer number 3, you've picked out someone.
Bill Jones, a neoliberal from Hope, Maine.
Do you have a bumper sticker on your car that says neoliberal?
I want to come back to trade.
Yeah.
Everybody pretty much agrees that trade is a good thing, and what we should do, and that we are the guilty party as much as anybody, if you take the St. Gallen research seriously, and that what we should do about it is do a better job of aiding the people who've suffered. But what can we do about trade in general? The most depressing thing I've heard here was from Senator Sununu, which is basically Congress and politically the U.S. isn't going to do anything constructive about trade. I wonder if there's a way of achieving the same objective by stealth.
And do you work for the government?
I did very briefly when Lyndon Johnson was president. Anyhow, what I'd like to see what you think about is if we do have carbon tax isn't very attractive, especially to Republicans. For Republicans, you have to call it a carbon cashback. Don't use the word tax. But a serious carbon tax has implications for trade because you have to protect yourself against other people taking advantage of the progress you make in doing that against having increasing species extinction. And the species in question is us. Could we attack obstacles to trade by protecting ourselves through a carbon tax?
Yeah, I mean, Simon, he's suggesting we use some of the stuff you've been finding that are not tariffs to engineer an outcome that he would like.
Let me say, I think we definitely need to accelerate the clean energy transition. We need a set of principles for how we subsidize that, which don't cause a whole bunch of trade tensions. Okay, clearly, looking at what's happened across the Atlantic in the last couple of months, we failed, right? So I have said to a number of different senior officials they should lock in a room with no windows and one door and keep 5 or 6 of the smartest trade officials in the world in there until they come up with these principles. It's not impossible. And these, I use the word principles deliberately, not rules or laws or anything like this. We need to have some rules of the road so countries can understand what the right policies are. And one very good one would be if you want people to buy electric vehicles, as long as the electric vehicle meets a certain standard, we should not differentiate between whether it's homemade or foreign-made, that type of thing. So this type of, I think, sensible guideline could be developed in that particular area. I must say, I'm not sure I see much appetite for carbon taxes around the world. I mean, Europe, even in Europe, where we are supposed to be, in the vanguard of this, look at the huge number of free emissions trading permits which are being given to different industries, and they're not being given on the basis of some climate considerations. Again, it's who shouts loudest, right? So no one is doing carbon taxes in a particularly clean way, I would argue. So let's go the other way. Let's think a bit about subsidy regimes which can be done and scaled up. And then, this goes back to we had a very good question earlier about the dissemination of these technologies to developing countries. We also, at that time when we think about subsidies for rich countries, we should be thinking about how do we make those technologies more affordable for developing countries too. So you could see a bit of a package coming together here, which could show that maybe we can cooperate a little bit on this side of the trade and climate change equation. So,
any other comments on stealth processes to further that agenda or any other?
Well, I mean, just briefly to come back to the beginning point you were making, I mean, I just think it's relatively simple. Like, most people have never cared about trade. Interest groups care about trade and are mobilized to affect trade policy. People care about their ability to buy food for their families, to earn a decent living, to go on vacation, to get health care when they need it, these basic things. And large numbers of people around the globe have concluded, quite legitimately, that what we've had for just about half a century in advanced economies leaves an awful lot of people out of that. And until we restore opportunities so that more people have faith that the overall policies are going to help them do those things that they actually care about, then they're going to be suspicious of every kind of policy, and especially trade, because it's so easy to go find, to David's point, the losers are very concentrated. The winners are diffuse. And so we got to restore that basic sense of opportunity to have a meaningful conversation about trade.
Volunteer 2.
Thank you. Mel Mackay from Camden. I wonder if panelists might comment on the roles that changes in global trade, adjustments to global trade can play or are actually playing in resolving or prolonging the war in Ukraine.
So trade structures helping or not resolve that conflict? Simon, first, and then we'll...
So last year with one of Caroline's colleagues in San Diego, we looked into this question quite extensively. And we simulated out a whole bunch of different sanction scenarios. And to our shock, we found that very few of them would have any serious effect on the Russian economy. At the time, this was not a very popular thing to say. Sadly, it's proved to be true, I think, on retrospect. When we dug into this, the biggest reason is that the sanctioning countries only buy about half of Russia's exports. And about a decade ago, they bought 60%. So the sanctioning coalition's leverage has gone down over time, okay? And so this, I think, limits how much we can strangle the Russian economy with sanctions. The second thing we did was to go back and look into history and to find out where sanctions have proved to be more effective. And we looked at the case of apartheid-era South Africa. And there, the sanctions were much more effective in bringing down South African GDP because transport costs to and from South Africa went through the roof. And so what we did then was to simulate what would happen if there was kind of a global ban or increased costs of shipping to and from Russia, maybe by making the insurance of shipping through Lloyd's of London more expensive, for example, right? No, I'm not picking on Senator Sununu here. This is exactly the vehicle you need. And I must say, fortunately, that those proposals were taken up, and the European Commission looked into them very carefully when they saw our analysis, and some variant of that has gone forward. So I think that is one way of doing it. And then I think the third thing, which will erode over time Russia's ability to extract oil and to compete, is their restricted access to high-end technologies like semiconductor chips. This will be problematic, but that's a slow burn.
Yeah, so just as an opportunity for short commercial, the reason that the world has been able to export grain out of Ukraine is because there was a negotiation between Lloyd's and other market participants in the UN to create exclusive grain corridors that obviously got the grain out to where it needed to be around the world. So, I mean, hats off to the insurance industry for finding a solution to a very serious problem.
Very good.
Other comments on this?
Yeah, just to go back to the trade and peace comment, I think one of the issues is that what Russia relies on is a very substitutable product. It's oil. So Russia can sell this product anywhere. And it's very different from the integration with China, which is on much more complex goods, and there isn't the same kind of market for it. And what it would have taken for the sanctions to work is for, all the big countries to go along, but they didn't. You have India still buying, China still buying. So there's another market for Russia. And I think that just really highlights kind of the split that's happening in the world, but trade isn't, because of the very specific product, Russia actually gained initially, and you saw the ruble fall and go right back up to where it was because the price of oil went up. And so, that I think is the fundamental problem here that's very different from other kinds of trade relations. Of course, the other trade that really matters is weapons, which is a complex issue, but some of the folks I've talked to in the defense industry think we're selling just enough to keep this war going, but not enough to end it. So.
A question from Riverside, Connecticut.
You had another knowledgeable response here.
I really was going to second a little bit of Simon's point, but to me, it is interesting to think about these Russian sanctions because in some ways they really have been different from many others, partly by how swift they were. This is really unusual for the world to act in this way. Second, by how comprehensive they were in the sense of they included all of these financial sanctions and this cutting off of Russia from SWIFT, et cetera, et cetera. And then they included the trade sanctions, which again, it's pretty comprehensive. But the problems are exactly what Simon is saying. Two things. One is we think of them as very comprehensive, very swift, very amazing. The world worked together. But when you actually sort of step back and look at the map of who's in on these sanctions, nobody south of the Rio Grande River. So you have no one, not Mexico or anyone in Latin America. No one in Africa, no one in the Middle East, no one in South Asia, no one in East Asia, no one in Asia other than Australia and New Zealand and Japan. So in some ways it feels to us in America like we're all in on this together. The reality is an awful lot of the world is not participating in the sanctions, and that does have an effect. And then the third thing I would say is really to underscore Simon's point is at some level, all of these sanctions don't bite for a significant period of time. So we just don't know yet. Particularly, the one that is really interesting from a trade perspective is this application of what they call the foreign direct product rule, which means even though the item, whatever it is, the good, the whatever it is, can be made anywhere, if it was made using certain U.S. technology or certain U.S. software, the U.S. stretches its long arm out and says, we don't care that it's 100% made in Korea or China or wherever. You cannot ship it to Russia. That's part of these sanctions. So far, most of those, I'm told, are holding, where countries are not shipping these products subject to the foreign direct product rule, are not going into Russia. Not clear, though. Those are ones that are the slow burn, because this is keeping out chips and semiconductors and those kind of components that will take time before we know whether they really will, if you will, stop feeding the Russian war beast at some level.
I just want to jump in on the financial sanctions because we're not even all in on the sanctions in our own country. Let's pause and remember that part of these financial sanctions, and we can debate the merits of this and whether this is a reasonable expectation, but they're aimed at making life impossible for Putin's cronies, the oligarchs, so they're supposed to put pressure on Putin to get out of Ukraine. The problem is that we've exempted, even in our own country, enormous parts of finance, including private equity. So if you're a Russian oligarch today and you're stupid enough to try to deposit a huge amount of money into JP Morgan Chase, that's not going to happen. But if you want to go give it to Steve Schwartzman's Blackstone Group, well, that's completely opaque. That's wide open. Part of the reason why we're not really going after Russia's oligarchs in this way, whether that's a good policy or not, is because we won't take on our own oligarchs.
Any more comments on Russia and trade? I want to make sure I'm not walking on anybody. So I was about to get to Jeffrey Robinson, Riverside, Connecticut. Wants to talk more about Africa. Why has Africa largely been left out of discussions of trade? We've touched on pieces of it, but sub-Saharan Africa is a potentially large market.
I can.
Simon, please, to start, and then Mark.
I think it's important to note that the Africans are really, really into trade, so much so that they've negotiated their own continental free trade agreement and are moving ahead quite quickly to implement it. And they are expecting that to be the engine of their trade growth in the decades ahead. So in some sense, it may not feel like they're very a central part of the discussions in Geneva, although I should add, on some issues, South Africa is very prominent. They're getting on with business in their own backyard, and why not? Sounds good to me.
Mark, did you have a comment?
Yeah, so a couple of different points here. One is the charts that were shown earlier in terms of just even regional integration. That has, for various reasons, but Simon just alluded to, right? Africa is further behind on itself regionally integrating. I would say one of the biggest reasons for that, of course, is colonialism, right? Because even if you compare it to India, right, the comment that was made, you certainly don't have the same type of infrastructure. You certainly don't have, across Africa, you don't have a set of common standards, common policies, and so forth. And so if you compare Africa as a region, right, why is that the case, right? That's because the colonial structures were set up to deliberately, I would argue, right, to not allow for those to happen, but instead to have the dependency on the metropole. So I think Africa is slowly trying to integrate some of that. I think the second part is most of the time when you've seen these types of engines of trade, something else has been pulling it from a capital investment standpoint. And so from a geographic standpoint, what would be the natural investors would be either European investors or those coming from Southwest or South Asia, right, from just geographic proximity. They each right now have seen other alternatives that have not made Africa as attractive, and partially because they have colonial modes of trade integration with those rather than thinking of these as manufacturing destinations. So it's a tremendously important question because obviously this is demographically the most fastest growing area in the world. Africa is a major part of the discussion when it comes to raw materials, particularly lithium, nickel, cobalt, and so forth, and it's a key part of the energy transition. But again, when I see those types of conversations, when I see those types of investments, this seems to be a repeat of the or neo-colonial type of element, as opposed to really putting Africa on a positive, fast growth step. And this has implications when we talk about multilateral trade reform, because there are 50 plus African members who have votes and who say, hey, you guys are talking about reform amongst each other. What about us? We've been neglected from all this. So I think this is an important piece of the puzzle that we have not really faced. How do we remedy the post-colonial elements and what's owed in this type of situation? Until we do that, multilateralism is going to have a hard time moving forward, and we're just going to see the same types of exploitation and the pushback against this from nationalist governments in Africa. And I haven't even gotten to inclusivity when it comes to women, when it comes to different small medium enterprises, right? There's a lot to talk about here, but I think that's sort of these basic historical elements are ones that are really holding things back from an integration, trade integration standpoint.
Volunteer one, who you got?
Hi, Nathan Rockwood from Ellsworth, Maine, and a volunteer here at the Camden Conference. So I've heard a lot of talk about nuclear power, but it seems like as a part of the energy mix, it's a fairly small proportion of it. I believe it was Dr. Cheeber mentioned that by 2050, India would only have maybe about 60 gigawatts of power from nuclear energy. And I'm wondering what steps are being taken to address two of the biggest issues that come with nuclear power, which is cost effectiveness and safety. Because it's not an overly attractive investment to many concerns, and there's still concerns over safety. Many of you probably remember 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl. So my question is, again, what steps are being taken to address cost effectiveness and safety with nuclear power?
Yeah, I can just say, nuclear has a fantastic safety record. No one died at 3 Mile Island. And in general, relative to the number of people we kill every year with coal pollution, it's done terrifically well. So the problems for nuclear are not really safety. It's waste disposal, which is a political problem. It's capital cost, and it's huge public apprehension. Like Germany's, trying to phase out all its nuclear power. It's a terrible idea. It's a terrible idea from the perspective of cost. It's a terrible idea from the perspective of the environment. It's a terrible idea from the perspective of dependency on Russia. So there's been a lot of efforts, I'm sure you know this better than I, to kind of come up with modern nuclear designs, but it's been very difficult to get them improved and very difficult to get them invested in. Bill Gates was working hard on this, and I think he had a safe reactor that was not. Anyway, I don't know enough details, but nuclear has been hugely maligned, and it's one where the left got it completely wrong, like right idea, wrong sign. All that protesting against Seabrook and so on was not only not productive, was counterproductive. And nuclear, we're lucky to have the plants we have. Most of them are going, they have to be decommissioned, they're so old, but they're the most cost-effective, safest, most reliable base power providers on our grid.
I hope I have that on tape. I'm going to share that with my father, who flipped the switch for Seabrook and would be very pleased and certainly agree with all that. It's still provides 20% of the base load in the U.S. That's a pretty big number. That's important, and it's obviously very, very stable. It's been very consistent through the years. It might be 17% now. It's probably down just a little bit, but I think last month there was, in terms of the capital costs, a new reactor design. It's a modular reactor. I think it's on the order of 10 megawatts. A typical reactor facility is 1,000 megawatts, for example, but this is modular, 10 megawatts, and they can be combined together to scale up. So it addresses both the capital cost, but also the any lingering questions about safety. That design was recently approved by the NRC, but permitting, construction, finding a site. So that's obviously not something that's going to happen tomorrow. But then finally, there is a new facility that will come online in the next couple of years in Georgia, which will be the first new facility in the U.S. to come online, maybe since Seabrook, if I had to guess.
I mean, I'm always struck with the waste issue, which hasn't been solved. And you mentioned it's a political issue. Who wants it in their backyard? We had a guy on the air who'd written a book, very progressive, full on both feet, jumping into energy conversion in America. Thinks we could be totally electric. Some people will not agree that this is a little aggressive time frame, but within 35 years, the whole economy. So he's coming from an aggressive point of view of going green, and you look at his numbers, and he's got nuclear in there. It's not, it's a lot of wind and other things, but nuclear is in that equation. So it's quite striking. Let me get back to the question that we put on the table earlier.
Yeah, Frank.
Allison Warden, I think if you sit through 2.5 days of us, hopefully you feel edified. Hopefully you have a much wider perspective on this incredibly interesting kaleidoscope of issues. But what do people do, individuals, small business people, in terms of assuming they want their livelihoods increased, assuming they want to make the world a better place? How can they engage this further? Any idea? Action points. Peter, I think of what you had said earlier about people just don't care about this stuff, they just care about their livelihoods. They're not like thinking meta about trade policy. But I think this is an invitation for, if you do want to move the needle on the stuff we're talking about, how do people frame that for themselves?
I'll kick us off.
Please.
So I think there's a big question and then there's small actions. And I think all of us, when we decide how do we want to spend our lives, right, we make these decisions all the time. And a lot of us who are academics tend to be drawn towards the big as opposed to the small. But from a very small standpoint, I think there's a question in terms of information and lack of information and so forth, and particularly with digital technology, your reach once you're able to aggregate that information and to spread that. I think that's really a powerful app that you can do from anywhere, right? But it takes the desire to actually spend the energy to accumulate that. So whether that's talking about looking at the carbon content or looking at the labor practices or looking at what's getting sourced somewhere, these are the types of small steps I think individuals can take. And, you know, Simon has shown how, right, individuals doing this with subsidies and aggregating this can actually provide a lot of information that drives policies. So I think every individual has the capability to do that from a small standpoint. From the big picture perspective, I would draw us back to what David mentioned earlier. This is just one of many disrupted elements that are making people feel more insecure. And I would argue probably technology is playing a larger role in making all of that happen. And so I think what individuals and small medium businesses can be doing and so forth is really looking at what types of safety nets, what types of welfare structures are necessary for when things go wrong, and to really put those in place. And those will vary depending on what community you're talking about, how much it's dependent on one source of jobs, what types of infrastructure capabilities in place, what types of education capabilities are in place. But I think that's where the focus needs to be on the big picture when it comes to trade.
Anyone else?
I'll just slightly embellish on the point. I do think one of the things that individuals can do is this issue of being informed. I remember when I was doing negotiations over textiles, there were all these surveys that came out to say, would you be willing to spend $1 more on a T-shirt to know that it was made without slave labor, without child labor, without all these things? And the survey results were off the charts in terms of 90% of people said, yes, I would do that. And then you look at what people actually bought. What did they actually buy? They bought the cheapest shirt. And part of that then also goes to, do you trust the information? I mean, if it says it's fair trade, if it says it's eco, if it says it's whatever, is that actually information that you can trust and that you should rely on? And there's where I do think both the combination of technology and other things can help us all do a better job, so that we really can have confidence in that label, in that information. And then a lot of it is then the burden on you to inform yourself and to decide that, no, I actually do care. I care enough to make this decision over that decision, assuming I can trust that the label itself or that the information was accurate. And so I do think there's a lot of work that can be done around making those accuracies out there, and then again, using all the tools that we have to make that information more readily and easily available.
So
Ajay, then
this is more for the young. I mean, I guess there's still some young people listening to us.
We hope.
So we've been told.
So I was thinking of
They're just
how many
holding on by their knuckles, but they're still here.
how many of them are followers of Greta Thunberg?
Yeah, they will be, sure.
There you go. So if you all follow Greta Thunberg, trade will disappear, because she only has 2 pieces of clothing and never flies in an aircraft. But the planet will be saved. So it'll mean the end of trade and no more need for all these discussions on trade policy. But I was just thinking that something, I mean, the CO2 per person is so high in many places that itself has to change. I mean, it can't be just that we find technological solution and there has to be a kind of, at our individual level, you got to be able to, whether you're running a small business or your own personal life, how is it that I can reduce my own CO2 that's kind of, a little bit of that has to happen too, so that while all the technological changes and renewable and all come in, some change in lifestyle, has to be, and you got to, at least if you buy, the Japanese, they only have, their apartments in the old days were so small that many of my Japanese friends told me, I only have 2 suits, Ajay. I don't have place in the closet for, between me and my wife to have more than 2 suits, and I wear, those 2 suits, and I have 1 or 2 pairs of shoes and that kind of thing. So, this lifestyle has to change. I mean, I don't want to pick on Vice President Al Gore because I admire him in other ways, but somewhere I read that he lived in a house of 12,000 square feet and said, I'm doing offsets, and I don't think offsets are good enough, You got to change your own lifestyle too. Thank you.
Peter had a comment too. Thank you, Ajay.
So, in Caroline's excellent overview yesterday, we got the wise caution that we shouldn't just assume that if everything's local, that's somehow better in terms of climate change, in terms of who's getting paid to do what. We should not think it's a wonderful thing that they're making milk in Saudi Arabia. That's not very productive use of fossil fuels to cool. But I think it would be wrong to take away from this conference that, globalization's here to stay. Yeah, it's changing, but that's still how it's going to be. And the admonition that we should try to go local is wrong. I mean, it's not an either-or proposition. There are some places where large-scale production, and depending upon where we're talking about consuming, it makes sense to ship things vast distances. China's still going to be a huge part of the global supply chain, wherever some of that production goes. But it's also true that if you're running a small business or you're a consumer and you can find somebody in your local community who you can support and cut out the obvious middle players. Look, you don't need a PhD in economics to understand that when you go buy a pair of Nike sneakers, you're sending money to Michael Jordan and a bunch of shareholders. They're not just going to the brilliant designers in Beaverton, Oregon. And we know that. If there's someone in your community who can satisfy your need, and everything everybody's saying about the need for greater transparency and understanding about the real conditions, standard setting bodies are helpful. We need watchdogs on that to help give us good information. So if you can do it local, that's great. And we're also going to have globalization, and we should try to make that more productive than it is now.
I see several hands as we're wrapping up here, but Paul, you've been patient.
It's just going to be tough. It is tough if you're a consumer to do what we all think we'd like to do. I mean, I just did a piece on eggs a couple of weeks ago, and I was asking somebody, didn't get into the piece, free-range eggs. I buy free-range eggs. And this was some expert in the poultry industry. He said, well, you know what free-range eggs means? And then I had it confirmed. It means that the eggs are in a hen house, but there's an open door. But that's it. It's not like the eggs, the hens go out. The door's open, that's free range. So it's really hard to do this, even though I take shorter showers, so there's not so much heat and all the rest. It's not easy to do that.
But it gets back to Jennifer's point about trust in systems used to disclose what it is you're buying.
That's what I was thinking, but I'm just saying it's tough, and it's tough to get any legislation that would actually mean that the hens were out there cavorting. That's.
Yeah, I mean, my daughter is an engineer, but she works with a consultancy that does the circular economy, and they're very strict about their definitions of what is a circular economy. And there are mushier definitions that don't buy all that much, and so there's this quest to make that rigorous. There are other hands as we're wrapping up. Anything? Carolyn, thank you.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say Jennifer brought up the case of Fiji water yesterday, and it made me laugh because we had this argument in my family where I would get very upset if the kids bought Fiji water because something like water shouldn't be imported, which I think was the point that Peter was making about, for some things, yeah, you know, local makes sense. For other things, it may not. But I also just wanted to remind about the other point I made with the environment, which is that a lot of these new goods, solar panels and wind turbines, nuclear plants that are, you know, the parts of them are produced in really complex value chains. And one of the professors at UC San Diego did a study looking at what happens if we fully decouple. And the thing is, the cost of all those goods goes way, way, way up, and the innovation goes way, way, way down. So there's also, just on the environmental goods, if we're not going to live like Greta, then we do need to shift to renewables, and that will require trade and cooperation and bringing scientists from other countries and working together, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, you'll remember my rules for the work that I do. I've shared them before. There are 3, right? Check your facts, try not to libel anybody, and end on time. Our clock has hit 0. We have another one of these important look-aheads before we thank our panel, which is what's happening next year in this venue. 2024, we are going to India.
Very good.
The bus to India will leave from in front of the Opera House, and that promises to be, you know, you heard what I said. You know, we don't just, the only benchmark is not population, but probably as we were in the conference, India's population eclipsed China's slightly. An amazing panel that we had here. John Sununu, Jennifer Hillman, Paul Salman, David Otter, I.J. Chibber, Mark Wu, Simon Evenett, Carolyn Freud, Doug Irwin, who couldn't be on the panel, and Peter Goodman. Special thanks to the folks at the Camden Conference, all the volunteers, but mainly to you and to you for all your attention and wisdom. See you next year.